Stalag Moosburg, Bavaria, April 12, 1945. The morning fog had not yet lifted from the muddy compound when Oberst Heinrich Weber stood at the wire fence, watching American prisoners of war unpack their Red Cross parcels. The colonel's greatcoat hung loose on his frame. He had lost nearly 20 pounds since Christmas, but it was not his own diminishing figure that commanded his attention that cold April morning. It was the casual abundance with which the American Kriegsgefangenen handled their rations, the almost careless way they traded chocolate bars for cigarettes, the substantial weight of the packages themselves. Weber had been an officer in the Wehrmacht for 17 years. He had witnessed the Blitzkrieg through Poland, stood in the ashes of Stalingrad, and commanded prisoners from a dozen nations. But nothing in his military education had prepared him for this moment of crystalline understanding. Germany was not merely losing the war through inferior tactics or waning morale. They were losing it calorie by calorie, gram by gram, one undernourished soldier at a time. In his left hand, Weber held a captured American K-ration. In his right, the daily allocation for a German frontline soldier. The comparison was devastating. The science of sustaining an army. To understand the moment of Weber's realization, one must first comprehend the mathematical precision required to fuel modern warfare. The human body is, in essence, a combustion engine, albeit one of remarkable complexity, that converts chemical energy into mechanical work. A soldier in combat does not merely walk. He runs, digs, lifts, carries, and fights, often under conditions of extreme stress and environmental hardship. The caloric calculus is unforgiving. American military nutritionists, working in collaboration with the University of Chicago's Laboratory of Physiological Hygiene, had determined through extensive field studies that a soldier engaged in moderate combat operations required approximately 4,500 calories per day to maintain body weight and operational effectiveness. Under conditions of extreme exertion, forced marches, sustained combat, cold weather operations, this requirement could surge to 5,500 calories or more. The American logistics apparatus, that vast and unprecedented industrial machine, had been designed from its inception to meet this standard. The German Wehrmacht, by contrast, had entered the war with ration allocations based on peacetime metabolic studies and First World War precedents. A German frontline soldier in 1945 received on paper approximately 2,150 calories per day. In practice, as supply lines collapsed and agricultural production faltered under Allied bombing, the actual delivered calories often fell below 2,000. The mathematical implications were stark. A German soldier operating at a 2,000-calorie deficit would burn through his body's fat reserves in a matter of weeks, then begin to cannibalize his own muscle tissue. Strength diminished, reaction time slowed, mental acuity degraded. The human body, pushed into prolonged caloric deficit, enters a state of metabolic conservation. Non-essential functions shut down first. Libido vanishes, emotional regulation falters, the capacity for complex decision-making erodes. A malnourished soldier becomes less of a warrior and more of a survival machine, focused on the singular, consuming objective of acquiring food. The American logistical miracle, Fort Lee, Virginia. September 1942, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Logan stood before a wall-sized map of Europe, colored pins marking projected supply routes through ports that did not yet exist, across beaches that had not yet been stormed. The Quartermaster Corps had been given an assignment of staggering scope: feed an army of millions across an ocean, in combat, without interruption, without failure, without compromise. The solution they devised represented nothing less than a revolution in military logistics. The American approach to feeding its forces rested on three fundamental principles: standardization, redundancy, and overwhelming volume. The K-ration, which Oberst Weber now examined with such fascination, exemplified this philosophy. Developed in 1942 by physiologist Ansel Keys at the University of Minnesota, the K-ration was designed as a lightweight, individual daily ration for soldiers in combat. Each unit consisted of 3 boxes, breakfast, dinner, and supper, packaged in waxed cardboard that could withstand moisture and rough handling. The breakfast ration contained a 4-ounce can of chopped ham and eggs, 4 crackers, a compressed cereal bar, a fruit bar, instant coffee, sugar tablets, and 4 cigarettes. The dinner box held a 2-ounce can of processed cheese. Crackers, a candy bar, typically Hershey's Tropical Bar, specially formulated to resist melting. Sugar tablets, a powdered beverage packet, and cigarettes. The supper ration included a 2-ounce can of pork luncheon meat, crackers, a packet of bouillon powder, a chocolate bar, instant coffee, and more cigarettes. The total caloric content, 3,126 calories. Not the ideal 4,500 for sustained operations, but sufficient for short-term field use, with the understanding that hot meal facilities would provide supplemental nutrition when possible. Critically, every K-ration was identical, could be consumed cold if necessary, and required no preparation beyond opening the cans with the included P38 opener, a tiny folding can opener that became one of the most valued pieces of equipment in the American military, but the K-ration was merely the most visible element of a far more comprehensive system. The C-ration, introduced in 1938 and continuously refined, provided a more substantial field meal in larger cans. The 10-in-1 ration fed 10 soldiers for 1 day and included sufficient variety to prevent menu fatigue. The B ration, prepared in field kitchens, approximated the quality and variety of mess hall food. And behind all of this stood the A ration, fresh food delivered to the front whenever logistics permitted. The numbers involved in this operation defy casual comprehension. By June 1944, the U.S. Army was moving 40 million pounds of supplies per day across the English Channel. Of this total, approximately 12 million pounds consisted of food and beverages. Each American soldier in the European theater received an average of 67 pounds of supply per week, of which 14 pounds were rations. German soldiers, by comparison, received less than 7 pounds of rations per week by late 1944, and the quality had degraded catastrophically. The Reichshunger Berlin, Ministry of Food and Agriculture. January 1945, Herbert Baca, State Secretary for Food and Agriculture, reviewed the reports with mounting desperation. The numbers told a story of systemic collapse. Agricultural production in Germany had fallen by 43% since 1943. The occupied territories that had once provided supplemental foodstuffs were lost. France liberated, the breadbasket of Ukraine reclaimed by the Soviets. The transportation network, systematically dismantled by Allied bombing, could no longer move food even where it still existed. German military planners had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They had assumed, based on the swift victories of 1939 to 1941, that the war would be won before resource limitations became critical. When the conflict metastasized into a global war of attrition, Germany lacked both the agricultural base and the logistical infrastructure to sustain prolonged operations. The standard German field ration, the Eisern portion, or iron ration, consisted of a can of preserved meat, usually 200 grams, hardtack biscuits, 250 grams, coffee extract, and salt. This was supplemented theoretically by daily distributions of bread, potatoes, and vegetables from field kitchens. In practice, by 1945, the bread was increasingly ersatz, made with sawdust, acorn flour, and other extenders, and the vegetables were often nothing more than turnip soup. The protein deficit was particularly acute. American soldiers consumed on average 115 grams of protein daily, primarily from meat, cheese, and eggs. German soldiers were lucky to receive 40 grams, often from lower quality sources. Protein deficiency manifests rapidly in combat soldiers. Wounds heal slowly. Resistance to disease plummets. Physical endurance collapses. Captain Hans Scheffer, A medical officer with the 6th Panzer Division kept detailed records during the winter of 1944-1945. His notes, recovered after the war, paint a grim picture. January 18th, 15 new cases of acute malnutrition in the company. Soldiers unable to perform basic tasks, legs swollen with edema, no energy reserves for sustained combat operations. February 3rd, requesting immediate augmentation of rations. Current allocation insufficient to maintain operational capacity. February 19th, request denied. No supplemental rations available. Sheffer's records include body weight measurements. Between December 1st, 1944 and March 1st, 1945, the average soldier in his unit lost 18.7 pounds. For men who were already lean from years of war, this weight loss represented a catastrophic loss of functional muscle mass. The moment of recognition, Stalag 7th. A. April 12, 1945. Afternoon, Oberst Weber sat in his office, the American K-ration disassembled on his desk like the components of a bomb he was trying to defuse. The chocolate bar alone contained 600 calories. The single can of processed meat held more protein than his own men received in 2 days. He had ordered his adjutant, Hauptmann Dieter Kruger, to conduct a survey. The results had arrived that morning. Of the 142 German guards at the camp, 97 had lost significant body weight since January. 12 were suffering from malnutrition severe enough to compromise their duties. The guards, who were not even engaged in combat operations, were slowly starving. Meanwhile, the American prisoners, sustained by Red Cross parcels and their own ration supplies, maintained robust health. Some had actually gained weight in captivity. Weber was not a political man, nor was he given to philosophical reflection. He was a professional soldier who understood tactics, logistics, and the practical requirements of maintaining fighting forces. But the evidence before him admitted no interpretation other than the obvious. Germany had failed at the most fundamental task of warfare, keeping its soldiers fed. The implications cascaded outward. How many defensive positions had been abandoned not because of Allied firepower, but because the defenders lacked the strength to hold them? How many counterattacks had faltered because soldiers couldn't muster the energy for sustained combat? How many equipment breakdowns resulted from weakened men unable to perform proper maintenance? He thought of the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last great offensive, launched just 4 months earlier. The operation had been predicated on capturing American fuel depots to sustain the advance. But there had been another unspoken objective, capturing American supply dumps. German soldiers had gorged themselves on American rations during the early days of the offensive. Some units had spent precious hours looting food rather than pressing the attack. Hunger had degraded discipline, distorted priorities, compromised operational objectives. Weber extracted a cigarette from the K-ration, American tobacco, smooth and mild compared to the ersatz German cigarettes made from cabbage leaves and wood pulp. He lit it and walked to the window. Outside, American prisoners played baseball in the yard, their movements vigorous, their voices carrying the easy confidence of well-fed men who knew with absolute certainty that their side would prevail. The technical dimensions of nutritional warfare, the differential in rations between American and German forces, represented more than mere caloric mathematics. It reflected fundamentally different approaches to industrial mobilization and technological innovation. American food scientists had applied the principles of industrial chemistry to military nutrition. The process of freeze-drying, developed commercially in the 1930s, allowed for the preservation of eggs, coffee, and vegetables with minimal weight and volume. The powdered orange and lemon juice included in many. American rations prevented scurvy, a disease that still occasionally appeared among German troops in isolated positions. The packaging technology alone represented a significant advantage. American rations used waxed cardboard boxes, hermetically sealed metal cans with easy open mechanisms, and moisture-resistant wrappings. German rations often arrived in simple paper wrappings that deteriorated in wet conditions or in metal tins that required specialized tools to open. The psychological dimension of food quality cannot be overstated. Soldiers who consistently eat monotonous, unpalatable food suffer from what military nutritionists term appetite fatigue. They consume fewer calories than provided because the food simply becomes too unpleasant to eat. American rations, while hardly gourmet fare, included sufficient variety and reasonably palatable components to maintain appetite. The inclusion of candy, chocolate, and cigarettes provided small psychological comforts that helped sustain morale. German soldiers, by contrast, faced rations of declining quality and diminishing variety. By 1945, the ersatz components had become so unpalatable that soldiers would often discard portions of their rations rather than force themselves to consume indigestible sawdust bread or rancid ersatz butter made from coal tar. Derivatives, the inclusion of cigarettes in American rations deserves particular attention. While the health consequences of smoking were not yet widely understood, cigarettes served multiple functions in the field. They provided a mild stimulant, reduced hunger pangs, offered a moment of psychological respite, and functioned as a universal medium of exchange. American soldiers could trade cigarettes for nearly anything. German soldiers, lacking adequate supplies of tobacco, were at a disadvantage even in the informal economy of warfare. The view from the ranks Private First Class Robert Morrison, 45th Infantry Division, remembered the moment he understood the significance of the ration differential. "We captured a German position near Aschaffenburg in March 45, Morrison recalled in a 1987 oral history interview. The Krauts had been dug in there for 2 weeks. When we cleared the bunkers, we found their rations. I couldn't believe it. They had these little hard biscuits, some kind of meat paste that smelled rotten, and this black bread that was more sawdust than wheat. We threw it all away. I wouldn't have fed it to a dog," Morrison continued. "What really got me was their faces when we offered them our C rations. These were supposed to be tough SS troops, you know, the fanatics. But they looked at that beef stew like it was a steak dinner. They ate it right out of the can, cold, and you could see them almost crying because it tasted so good. That's when I realized these guys weren't super soldiers. They were just starving." Gefreiter Klaus Hoffmann of the Wehrmacht's 352nd Volksgrenadier Division provided the German perspective in post-war interrogations. "By February, we were obsessed with food." That is not too strong a word. Obsessed. Every conversation came back to it. What we would eat after the war. What we had eaten before the war. Recipes our mothers made. We talked about food more than we talked about women, more than we talked about going home. When we captured American positions, we didn't look for weapons or ammunition first. We looked for food. I personally saw men risk their lives to recover American rations from a burned-out supply truck. 3 men died retrieving that food. Under fire for C rations and chocolate bars. Hoffman's account reveals the fundamental degradation of combat effectiveness that accompanies severe nutritional deficit. Soldiers who are preoccupied with hunger cannot maintain tactical focus. Units that prioritize food acquisition over military objectives have ceased to function as effective fighting forces. The Strategic Calculus Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force Versailles, March 1945. The logistics officers understood what many combat commanders did not. The war was being won in the supply depots and transportation networks long before it was decided on the battlefield. General John C.H. Lee, commander of the Communications Zone of the Logistics Organization supporting Allied forces in Europe, presided over an operation that moved supplies with unprecedented efficiency. The statistics were staggering. The United States was producing 45% of the world's manufactured goods while simultaneously fielding armies on 3 continents and oceans spanning the globe. American farms mechanized to a degree unmatched by any other nation. produced food surpluses even while millions of men were withdrawn from agricultural work for military service. The contrast with Germany could not have been more stark. German agriculture, still heavily dependent on horse-drawn equipment and manual labor, suffered from acute labor shortages as men were conscripted for military service. The use of forced labor, prisoners of war, and concentration camp inmates proved grossly inefficient. Sabotage was common, productivity remained low, and the moral degradation of the system contaminated every aspect of German war production. By 1945, Germany was consuming its seed corn, literally. The grain that should have been reserved for spring planting was being ground into flour to feed soldiers who would be dead or captured before the harvest. The German military-industrial complex had entered a terminal spiral of resource depletion, American K. Planners recognized that sustaining adequate nutrition for their forces provided not merely a tactical advantage, but a strategic one. Well-fed soldiers fought better, recovered from illness faster, maintained higher morale, and could sustain operations indefinitely. The cumulative effect, multiplied across millions of soldiers over years of combat, was decisive. The human cost, but statistics, however compelling, cannot capture the human dimension of nutritional warfare. The hunger experienced by German soldiers in the final months of the war represented a form of suffering that transcended military defeat. Dr. Werner Heisenberg, a medical officer, no relation to the physicist, wrote in his diary, March 14, 1945, "The men are no longer men. They are animated skeletons. I see eyes sunken deep in skull sockets. I see legs swollen with edema. I see wounds that will not heal because the body has no resources for repair. I see soldiers who weep from weakness, who cannot lift their rifles, who fall asleep on watch because their bodies are shutting down from starvation. And I think, we did this to them, not the Americans, not the British. We, the German High Command, the logistics officers, the politicians who promised victory while failing to provide the most basic necessities of war. We sent these men to fight on empty stomachs and called it duty. We asked them to defeat an enemy who ate 3 hot meals a day while we gave them turnip soup and sawdust bread. The crime is not in losing the war. The crime is in how we treated our own soldiers while losing it. The malnutrition suffered by Wehrmacht soldiers in the war's final months produced long-term health consequences for survivors. Longitudinal studies conducted in the 1950s and 1960s found elevated rates of osteoporosis, chronic digestive disorders, and cardiovascular disease among men who had served in the German military during the final year of the war. The body remembers starvation, and it exacts payment for years afterward. Liberation and Aftermath Stalag 7 I, Moosburg, April 29, 1945. The American 14th Armored Division rolled through the gates of the camp shortly after noon. Oberst Weber, having surrendered without resistance, stood with his officers as American soldiers distributed rations to the liberated prisoners. The German guards, hollow-eyed and gaunt, watched silently as their former prisoners received food in quantities that would have sustained the entire German garrison for a week. Private First Class James Chen, one of the liberated American prisoners, recalled, "The German guards looked worse than we did. That's the God's honest truth. We'd been getting Red Cross parcels pretty regularly, even toward the end. But those German guards, they looked like death warmed over. I actually felt sorry for them. They were just boys, most of them 16 or 17 years old, and they were starving." An American medical officer conducted a hasty assessment of the German guards. Of the 142 men, 47 required immediate medical intervention for acute malnutrition. 12 were hospitalized. 3 subsequently died from complications related to prolonged starvation, their bodies too damaged to recover, even with adequate nutrition restored. Weber himself survived the war, though he never regained the weight he had lost. In a 1967 interview with a German historical commission, he reflected on that April day when he had examined the American K-ration. I knew then that we had lost. Not would lose, had already lost. A nation that cannot feed its soldiers has already been defeated. Everything after that was merely the formality of surrender. The Americans did not beat us with better tanks or better planes, though they had those too. They beat us because their soldiers had full stomachs and ours had empty ones. Everything else followed from that simple fact. The lessons of the caloric divide, the differential in military rations between American and German forces during World War II offers lessons that extend far beyond the specific context of that conflict. It demonstrates with brutal clarity that modern warfare is fundamentally a contest of industrial capacity and logistical sophistication. Tactical brilliance and individual valor, while never irrelevant, cannot compensate for systemic failures in the provision of basic necessities. The American achievement in sustaining adequately nourished forces across multiple theaters of war, over distances spanning continents and oceans, for years of sustained combat, represented a logistical feat without historical precedent. It required not merely abundant resources, though America's industrial capacity was certainly a prerequisite, but also unprecedented organizational sophistication, technological innovation, and commitment to the welfare of individual soldiers. Germany's failure in military nutrition reflected deeper failures of strategic planning, industrial mobilization, and moral vision. The Nazi regime's contempt for lesser peoples, manifold in the starvation of prisoners of war and concentration camp inmates, mirrored a broader indifference to human welfare that ultimately extended to Germany's own soldiers. A system built on exploitation and contempt for human dignity proved incapable of sustaining the complex logistical networks required for modern warfare. Epilogue: The Weight of Victory, Fort Myer, Virginia. November 11, 1985. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Logan, now 92 years old, stood at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, his uniform heavy with decorations from a lifetime of service. A young officer, recognizing the elderly man's Quartermaster Corps insignia, approached respectfully. "Sir, what did you do in the war?" the young officer asked. Logan smiled slightly. "I made sure our boys had full stomachs," he replied. "Doesn't sound very glamorous, does it?" "No, sir," the young officer admitted. "Son, let me tell you something about war," Logan said. "The history books will tell you about battles won and lost, about generals and strategy and tactics. But I'll tell you what really won World War II. It was breakfast. It was lunch and dinner. It was coffee and candy bars and cigarettes. It was making sure that every single soldier, from the Rhine to the Pacific, could count on being fed. That was the victory. Everything else was just details. I met a German officer once after the war. He told me he knew Germany had lost when he saw what we were feeding our prisoners. He said you could measure the outcome of the war in calories. I never forgot that. You want to understand military history? Start with the rations. Find out who ate well and who went hungry. That'll tell you who won almost every time." The young officer nodded, not fully understanding. Not yet. Understanding would come later, after deployments, after logistics nightmares, after watching his own soldiers operate in the field. Then he would remember this conversation and realize that the old man had given him the most important lesson of military science. Before tactics, before strategy, before all else, comes the simple, essential task of keeping soldiers fed. The fog of war obscures many things: intentions, capabilities, the movements of armies. But it cannot disguise the fundamental arithmetic of human metabolism. An army marches on its stomach, the old saying goes, and when those stomachs are empty, the march ends. The German officers who saw American GI rations in those final months of World War II understood this truth with terrible clarity. They were watching their soldiers lose weight, lose strength, lose the war, one missed meal at a time. The evidence lay not in grand strategies or decisive battles, but in something far more prosaic: the weight of a chocolate bar, the protein content of a can of ham and eggs, The simple fact that American soldiers ate well, while German soldiers starved. History is shaped by such mundane realities. Victory, it turns out, can be measured in calories.